You know, I have to admit, I did not expect to be making a video about an Armored Core game pretty much any time soon, at any point while I've been making these videos. I mean, I've literally never even heard of this series until Armored Core 6 was announced, simply because FromSoft is such a huge studio now. But man, this game, it's just... Mmm. So yeah, I figured I'd maybe sit down and talk about how great this game is for a bit. For the record, what happened that led me to playing this game in the first place was essentially, I'm still trying to finish up Baldur's Gate, but when they announced that they were going to be releasing a couple of major patches that were going to improve the performance and even change some of the endings and make a bunch of other minor changes, I figured I'd maybe take a break from that game and try to work through some of my backlog, since this year has had no shortage of great games to try out. And since Armored Core 6 just came out, I figured, well, I've been greatly enjoying FromSoft's catalog, and I love giant robots, might as well give it a shot. And, well, fast forward to now, and I've already beaten the game, and I'm still playing through it again on New Game Plus. I mean, this is definitely one of those games that feels both incredibly intimidating, especially when you first look at that insane stat screen, but it also feels weirdly approachable at the same time, which I guess is kind of FromSoft's, like, main MO in a way, since that's also kind of how I felt when I first played Dark Souls. But yeah, it's also worth noting that I can really see how shared the DNA is between FromSoft's Souls-style games as well as Armored Core, or rather, I guess I should say, I can see how the Souls games evolved from Armored Core, since Armored Core apparently came first. It's actually pretty funny. While I was looking up the history of the series while I was writing this video, apparently back in the day, a lot of people were really skeptical of FromSoft when they first announced that they were making a slow-paced fantasy melee combat game, as opposed to their usual fast-paced mecha building series that they were known for at the time. And of course, now, ironically enough, they're almost exclusively known for those slower-paced Souls-style games, and hardly anyone knows them for literally anything else that they've done. I mean, they're the ones that made that America simulator back in the day.
Okay, let's party!
And that game is still hilarious every single time I remember it. But yeah, it's actually kind of interesting to think about the design of the Souls games with the additional context of how Armored Core works. Suddenly it makes sense, to me at least, why they would bind the main attacks to the shoulder buttons, because in Armored Core, each shoulder button corresponds to a specific weapon slot, so in the Souls games, they made each side of the shoulder buttons correspond to a particular hand, as opposed to how most other action games like, say, Monster Hunter would work, where your attacks are primarily on the face buttons, and the shoulder buttons are reserved for things like sprinting or special actions instead. It also kind of explains why the Souls games have such a complex stats screen with way more specialized attributes than almost any other fantasy RPG would ever have. I mean, they separated out strength and carrying capacity between two different stats. I feel like hardly any other game would do stuff like that. I mean, they even have the same sort of differentiation between how resistant you are to different kinds of attack damage that you can see on shields in both games. But yeah, before I risk this video sounding too much like a Armored Core is the Dark Souls of FromSoft games style video, it's also worth pointing out how this game is extremely different from the more well-known series. Something that I think has only gotten more true as the Souls games has gone on is that you're mostly expected to be able to make whatever sort of build you want. Whether you want to be a straightforward typical melee guy, or playing a full-on wizard or a cleric, or maybe a fast two-weapon fighter, or some kind of mix between a couple of different playstyles and so on, you could pretty much do whatever suits you and then run that for basically the entire game. Obviously, you can still mess up your build, which can make things harder for you, but you can also usually just grind your way out of that problem and it's not that big a deal. And when you inevitably get to a hard boss, your main methods of overcoming that challenge are to either grind to increase your stats, or to learn the boss's patterns to just get better at fighting them. But Armored Core takes a very different approach to this kind of problem. For one, there isn't really a huge sense of vertical progression. Like, for example, I've said before that I've already beaten this game, but I'm still using some of the starting equipment that you have on your very first mech that you begin the game with. Like, I'm still using the starting laser sword that you get for free on some of my builds, including my melee-focused build. You do get a ton of new parts, of course, to upgrade your mech with, but from what I can tell, most, if not all of the parts are essentially side grades that have their own advantages and disadvantages. For example, a gun may deal more damage or fire faster than another gun, but it always comes with some kind of trade-off, like maybe it takes longer to reload, or it simply weighs more, or consumes more energy. And a huge part of the game when you're making your build is trying to balance out your energy and weight to better optimize your mech. So when you unlock more kinds of weapons and robot parts and stuff, it's less about making your mech stronger, necessarily, and more about making your mech more specialized for a certain flavor of combat. And that's really what the other huge difference is between Armored Core and other FromSoft games. Like I said, when you get stuck at a boss, typically you're just expected to get better at reading the boss's tells and at fighting him. And sure, that obviously is still there to some extent in this game, but there's a reason why the game also gives you the option to swap out your build literally every single time you die. It's so that you can tailor your mech to suit the situation better. The game is all about primarily using the right mech for the job and not just trying to make a single mech that does everything. For example, let's take a look at Balteus. Balteus is the first really big wall that I think most people hit, especially if they're new to the series like I am. I mean, I got stuck at him for, well, more hours than I'm probably willing to admit. There is the tutorial boss, which is a lot more real of a fight than most people expect that early on in the game. And there's the Juggernaut fight that comes a little bit later, which I've seen be a little tricky for some people, but I think most people are able to get through those fights with just some good old-fashioned elbow grease and trial and error. Meanwhile, I got stuck at this asshole for hours trying to smash my face against him. And my problem was that I was too attached to the build that I was running, and as a result, I wasn't trying out alternate builds to try and approach the situation from a different angle. In this game, some builds are just not going to be very effective against certain bosses, and you're going to have to try different things from time to time to make them work. For example, I've also seen a lot of people that have posted a few builds that make the Balteus fight a lot easier, and I've also seen an interesting backlash to that, where some people will kind of scoff at the idea of even using those builds for quote-unquote cheesing the boss, but like at the same time, I feel like that's the point of the game. That, like I said, the game expects you to experiment and try out different builds. There's a reason why they let you change out your mech every time you die. And redoing your entire mech to try something else is basically, I think, the lesson that Balteus is trying to teach you. And actually, when you think about it and analyze the level structure up to that point, I think they do some pretty good level design if you pay attention. For one, the first part of the level involves a large area where you gotta deal with a bunch of giant laser turrets and snipers. In order to get through this, you either need to have a fast and agile mech that's capable of dodging all these lasers, as well as, of course, the skills to back that up, or a strong tanky mech that can shrug them off, both of which are good for dealing with Balteus. And if you settle for a middle-of-the-road build, you'll likely struggle. This is then reinforced by the fight against the fellow AC near the end of the level before you fight Balteus. He's kind of a mini-boss and he's really fast and agile, so again, you either need to be fast enough to keep up with him or tanky enough to just deal with his bullshit. But then they also give you another clue based on what weapons he uses. See, he wields this sort of energy weapon that doesn't deal a ton of damage on its own, but it is tailor-made for breaking down shields. On top of that, this is still in Chapter 1, fairly early on in the game, relatively speaking, and your starting mech doesn't have anything equipped in its left shoulder slot. And when you unlock the ability to buy parts for the first time, one of the first things that you will see that fits that slot is a shield. And I think a lot of people, especially coming from other FromSoft games like I did, are going to latch onto the idea of using a shield and hold on tight for dear life. So as a result, when you get to that fight, the lesson you learn right away, if you're still using a shield, is that that weapon is going to be good at just straight up ruining your shield, which both encourages you to play more aggressively, which the game clearly wants you to do, and also teaches you how effective that kind of weapon is against that kind of defense. And of course, conveniently enough, that weapon is already unlocked and available to be bought by that point in the story. And when you get to Balteus himself, lo and behold, he has a giant-ass shield around him at all times. And he also just has a frankly upsetting number of missiles, but like I said, that's why the game is encouraging you to either be agile enough to dodge them or tanky enough to tank them. So if you put everything together, then the game is trying to tell you about the kind of specialized mech you need to bring in for this fight. You either need to be fast enough to dodge all the missiles or durable enough to tank them. And you need to have some answer for his shield, because if you don't, you're just not going to make any meaningful progress. And so it encourages you to either use the weapon that the previous mini-boss was showing you how to use, or at least find something similar to help whittle down his shield. And when you put it all together, that pretty much describes the kinds of builds that people are posting online to supposedly cheese the fight. But yeah, I didn't expect this to suddenly turn into a breakdown of the game's first wall, but here we are. To try and move on to other parts of the game, I just have to say that this game feels so good to play. I doubt that I'm the best example of this, because like I said, I'm still fairly new to the series, but man, if there was one thing I wouldn't have expected from a FromSoft, based on their more recent popular output, it's such fluid and fast-paced movement that just feels so good in the hands. Like, I'm not saying that Dark Souls and Elden Ring and stuff are bad to control. They're very good and responsive in their own more slower and methodical way, whereas Armored Core it has this speed to it that is really appealing, and yet you still always feel like you're in control of the action. The only real complaint I had against the movement controls, in my opinion, is just that I'm one of the kinds of people that grips their controllers way too hard during intense action sequences, so I keep accidentally pressing down on the left stick, which is bound to a fairly important and very flow and battle-changing movement where you enter your turbo boost state. And accidentally entering that state has gotten me killed more than a couple of times. But I was able to fix that by just kind of swapping around the buttons for scanning and turbo boosting, so that now when I accidentally press down the button, I just do a harmless scan, so it's not really that big of a deal anymore. And once I did that, I also learned a few other things, like how to properly lock on to multiple enemies with missiles by just holding down the lock-on button. And once you really get a handle on the game's combat, it really comes together into something that's just super fun. I mean, you could do some awesome straight-up mecha anime style moves. The way you can dodge while turbo boosting towards an enemy, the way that missiles fly through the air and scatter before homing in on a group of enemies, the feel of landing a solid melee hit or a strong charge attack, it's just so good. And I will fully admit that this game can be super intimidating at first, especially when you first open up the customization menu and you can see just how many parts and weapons you can swap out and how many stats there are. But I think the game does a decent enough job of making sure that you don't have to worry too much about that stuff early on, and giving you time to kind of work things out for yourself. What matters the most in the early game, in my opinion, is just finding weapons that you can carry, that you like, and making sure that you have weapons that are good for the boss that you're fighting, especially with the aforementioned Balteus fight. There's still plenty of nuance, but like I said, early on it matters more that you understand the basic controls and movement options more than the nuances of making an optimized build. And then over time, you start to piece together that, like, oh, maybe this booster would actually be better for this mech, or maybe if I put on these legs, then that'll let me jump higher and I can save energy, and so on and so forth. And it definitely helps. They have a very detailed tooltip screen where you can highlight every single stat in the game, and it'll actually tell you in pretty straightforward terms exactly what it actually does. And oh my god, I can't believe I almost forgot to mention the customization options. Like, my god, the customization in this game is so good. I have spent hours just, painting and building my perfect robot. I mean, I tried to keep things relatively modest, but I've seen people go absolutely insane with this, painting different limbs with slightly different color schemes to make them fit better, and throwing decals all over the place, making their own custom decals from scratch. I'm pretty sure people have already figured out a way to import images so that they could draw things like in Photoshop and then import them into the game to do all kinds of crazy stuff. Like, the customized, like, it's, I feel like this is like the first, if not second, most important thing to have in a mecha game like this, because people love painting their giant robots, and like the ability to make your robot look cool as hell it's so satisfying and fun, and I love how much detail there is in the customization in this game. But yeah, I think you get the idea by now. I don't think I really need to explain my opinion any further than I already have at this point. This game is great, and even as someone who has literally never even heard of this series before, I absolutely love just booting it up from time to time to fight some robots. I mean, hell, I haven't even really played any mecha combat games at all before this, let alone Armored Core 6, and now I have a hard time not experimenting with my builds constantly and wanting to just hop back in for another round in the arena, or even hopping into PvP. I mean, so yeah, I think I can give this game a solid recommendation. Yet another winner for 2023 that's going to make picking a game of the year that much more difficult this year. I mean, hell, at this point, just narrowing down the list to a handful of nominees might be hard this year. I might have to give out multiple awards or something. But yeah, anyways, I'm eager to see what you guys have to say in the comments below. Have you tried Armored Core 6 yourself yet? I'm actually really curious to see what fans of the older games think about the new one and how it changes things compared to these older games. I mean, the last game came out like 10 years ago or something like that, and I know, of course, the series is much older than that is on top of it, so I'm kind of curious to see what the thoughts of these older fans are like, and of course, I'm even curious to see what other newer fans like myself have been experimenting with the game as well, so let me know down in the comments to see what you have to say, but until next time, I guess I'll see you guys later.